Welcome to the Swim Chats podcast. I'm Shona Riddell, a writer, former journalist, and ocean swimmer from Wellington, Aotearoa, New Zealand. For each episode, I'll feature a different guest from our swim community. They'll be dippers, adventure swimmers, coaches, and conservationists with one thing in common. They all love being in the sea. So whether you're a swimmer yourself or just interested in stories about the ocean and people expanding their comfort zones, I hope you enjoy these swim chats. Please hit follow or subscribe so you don't miss an episode. This is the first ever swim history episode that we've done in the history of this podcast, which has been running a whole 2 weeks. It's very exciting. And today we have a special guest, John Hancock, who is a Wellington ocean swimmer. I know you're a marathon swimmer, John, as well, and the organiser of our annual ANZAC Day swim. So welcome, John, to the show.
Kia ora, Shona.
Kia ora. And would you mind explaining to us exactly what an ANZAC Day swim is for people who don't know?
Yeah, so you explained to me before we started recording that you're aiming to build an enormous international audience.
That's right.
Not
Grand
everyone
things.
will know what an ANZAC is. So the acronym ANZAC, it stands for the Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, and it was a division of the Allied forces in um, World War One, I think, um, uh, and it's also the name of a biscuit which children use to raise money uh, in New Zealand and Australia today, which is very delicious.
Good
But
point.
uh, it's most famous for an incident in World War One. Have I got that right? Gallipoli is World War One. Yeah, that's right. Where the combined ANZAC forces were sent in to a beach in Turkey at Gallipoli, where the number of soldiers who were killed was quite disproportionate. And so both Australia and New Zealand have a Memorial Day every year, so a public holiday every year called Anzac Day to commemorate the deaths at Gallipoli, which is still very strongly supported. A lot of Australians and New Zealanders go to Gallipoli Cove every year to remember the dead. Um, and as a public holiday, certainly in the time I've lived in New Zealand, it's still widely observed. Yeah, so that's the sort of Anzac in popular culture reference that some people might not have.
That's right. And we all have slightly different connections to Anzac Day. And as you mentioned, there's the biscuit, which is very delicious, and I try and bake each year. And a family story I have is that we had a pet tortoise in our family who came from Gallipoli and was picked up by a soldier in the trenches. We named him Peter, and he lived in my family for over 80 years and 4 generations. He finally passed away in the mid 1990s when I was a teenager. Yeah, so the Gallipoli landings were special to me for that reason as well, which is not related to swimming, but I thought I would just add that in.
Um, yeah, so I mean, you very kindly invited me onto your podcast to talk about the Anzac Day swim that we run in Wellington. So again, cultural reference. So Wellington is the capital city of New Zealand. Um, uh, Wellington's at the bottom of the North Island of New Zealand, and it's famous in marathon swimming world because it's the mouth of the Cook Strait. So the Cook Strait is one of the ocean's 7 great transcontinental crossings, which everyone is getting very excited about around the world.
And this is a swim you have done yourself, I know. So
Yes, yes,
uh,
that's right. I
we
was
can, y-
number 147. So there you
yeah,
go.
congratulations. That's
Uh,
awesome. And yeah, so I might ask you a few questions about that after if you're open to that.
yeah,
Uh, and
sure.
oh, And I participated in the Anzac Day swim last year. I remember it was a bit blustery,
Yep.
and so it was moved to Haitaita Beach, which is just a little bit more sheltered from the northerly.
Yeah.
It was a great time. It was a well-organised event, and I remember you gave a talk at the beginning about, Sir Bernard Freyberg. Uh,
That's
it was sort of the subject of
uh,
the
uh, the
the swim.
memorial in Wellington. So, I mean, should absolutely confess to what a fraud I am being on your podcast. The idea of having a swim on Anzac Day in Wellington wasn't my idea. It was one of my friends from the triathlon club. This is Major Albie Rothman, and his now wife, Lieutenant Claire Kirby. So at the time, they were both serving soldiers, and both of them decided that it would be a great idea to commemorate the special connection that we have in Wellington with uh, Gallipoli and Anzac through Sir Bernard Freyberg. And with enormous style, the two of them decided to organise the first of our Anzac Day swims. I think it was 2019, but it might have been even earlier than that. So they got in touch with the media. We had TVNZ and TV3 cameras both turned up, and both of them turned up in full dress, very, very smart. Albie did this wonderful speech about Sir Bernard Freyberg at Gallipoli. We had dozens of swimmers. We might have had over 100, and it was on the national news on both of the major channels that evening.
Oh,
And
that's brilliant.
I can't find the footage. It's obviously gone down, so that's very sad. Otherwise, it would have been great to be able to point, but it was terribly impressive. And they told this incredible story. So, Sir Bernard Freyberg is quite an important character in New Zealand history because he was the first Governor General of New Zealand, and uh, our one of our main swimming pools in Wellington is named after him. And the pool is next to a beach, which is where we started the first Anzac Day swim, and where you didn't do your Anzac Day swim last year because it's exposed to the predominant northwesterly wind, and every single time the wind's strong there, it's incredibly rough and choppy in the harbour, which is about 50% of the time. Uh,
Yeah.
but the reason that the pool and the beach are named after Bernard Freyberg is, as well as having this very distinguished career as Governor General and as a soldier, as we will hear, when he was a schoolboy, he was a great swimmer. And he grew up in the suburb that overlooks the beach, actually in Roseneath. He actually grew up in Hawker Street, which is one of the main roads to the top of Mount Victoria, which is all very domestic and local. He went to the local boys' school, Wellington College, and he was the New Zealand 100-yard swimming champion, which is rather wonderful. And he actually swam in the same place that the Freiburg pool has now been built. But back then it was called the Te-Rau Baths, and it was just an enclosure in the sea. So it wasn't a swimming pool in the sense we think of it now. It was just a sort of enclosed bit of sea.
Like an
These
ocean hole.
an
Ocean.
ocean pool, that's right.
Mhm.
So these were very, very common in Australia and New Zealand in the early 20th century. So very, very distinguished swimmer in his own right. He was also a pioneering surf lifesaver. I didn't even know we had surf lifesaving clubs over 100 years ago, but he was a pioneering member of the Lyell Bay Surf Lifesaving Club. So there you go. Um, but he left school at 16 and did an apprenticeship as a dentist in Morrinsville up in the Waikato, and apparently hated it. So he decided to join the army. Um, and got bored with that and headed off to America to go and seek his fortune. And one of the challenges I've found with the Anzac Day swims is to try and think of something new to tell the swimmers every year. So the story that Albie told everyone back in 2019 is that he briefly participated in the Mexican Civil War and then went on to get involved in the British forces supporting the campaigns in World War One. So I'll come back to that later on because we found out more about Freyberg's rather exotic history in the Mexican Civil War last year, but I
Oh,
won't
right.
distract you. Uh, yeah, so having sort of meandered his way, seeking sort of stimulation in America, when World War One broke, he tried to get his way to find passage in across the Atlantic to get to the UK so that he could get involved in the war, and couldn't raise enough money. So the story is that he won his passage in a bare knuckle boxing fight in Harlem. Won his fight, bought his ticket, and then arrived in England. And another story, Bernard Freyberg's life is full of these amazing stories. So he apparently got enrolled in the Royal Navy by accosting Winston Churchill in the street. And Churchill was so impressed that he introduced him and he became a company commander in one of the battalions that wound up on the Gallipoli Peninsula and were involved in the operation at ANZAC Cove. So this is where we come back to swimming, and the story was that the intention was that this battalion would set off some distractionary flares and try and draw the enemy forces away from the peninsula where the main Gallipoli landings were intended to be. And the idea was that boats would come ashore, they'd let off the flares, and then they'd retreat. But Freyberg decided that this was too risky and that the enemy would see the boats and that the plan wouldn't succeed. So he announced that he was going to swim, and so he covered himself in black sooty grease so that he couldn't be seen and swam, towing a little raft behind him with all these flares, a light, a compass, and a revolver, rather. And it's like a boy's own, sort of story, this amazing thing. He got to shore, lit flares in three different places, swam back out away from the beach, and was picked up a couple of hours later, having swum 3K or something like that successfully. Unfortunately, didn't manage to prove the great distraction given the tragedy at Anzac Cove, but it's an amazing story.
It
Uh,
is. And
the,
I suppose nobody was measuring the water temperature, but I
no,
mean, it would have been pretty cold.
What's that? Somebody one year we did this. Somebody had tried to find out what the temperature had been the same day in Turkey that we were doing the swim in Wellington, and I think it was almost identical. So
Oh, there you go.
channeling the same thing. Um, yeah, but he was an amazing guy. He won the Victoria Cross. He won the Distinguished Service Order, the French Croix Militaire de Guerre. He was mentioned in dispatches 6 times through his life. Um, and at the end of the First World War, most people would have sort of decided that was enough. When World War II broke out, he was then involved in military operations from the start to the finish of the war, and led the Second New Zealand Expeditionary Force. So that was a big, big troop. And of course, as soon as he got back, he was knighted and then served 2 terms as the New Zealand Governor General. So quite an amazing bloke, really, who we see every day, really, when we swim down at the beach. There's even a little picture of him when you walk into the swimming pool and a little sort of board with all of his life achievements.
Brilliant, isn't it? I like how he's remembered, a century later,
Yeah,
and how we have this special tradition of an annual Anzac Day swim because we have dawn ceremonies around the country to commemorate the, you know,
yeah,
the the soldiers and the fallen. But I like how there are different ways of remembering war, yeah, and
yeah.
something a bit different, isn't it?
I mean, the other thing we've loved is, as I said, is trying to think of something new to say every year. So, we add the details like what the water temperature was in Anzac Cove and so on and so on. But last year, I was racking my brains trying to think what on earth I could talk about, which wouldn't bore everyone rigid. And I found an article that had been published by some military historian that year. And the article is called Debunking Freyberg's Mexico Myth. And I'm just going to read it to you because it's really quite funny. So I've told you this amazing catalogue of adventures that the guy involved himself in. And the summary of this academic article is: military hero Bernard Freyberg's illustrious career reads like an episode from the Boy's Own Annual. His courage and command in the two world wars made him a global celebrity. His adventurous aura enhanced by his apparent service as a mercenary in the Mexican Civil War in 1914. Even today, biographers proclaim this participation as a fact, but in reality, he spent the 3 months before the outbreak of war in California and left for London from San Francisco. Freyberg himself appears to have propagated the Mexican myth, not the only time he played fast and loose with facts about his early life.
Fake
His,
news.
his early fake news.
Yeah.
Apparently, the reason that this happened was that, of course, it wasn't just before the internet. This was before widespread use of the wireless. So the main way that people got their news about what was happening in other countries was through newspapers, and there was often quite a delay, and often quite muffled transmission of information as newspaper stories traveled around the world. So the story about his involvement in the Mexican Civil War was a newspaper article, and the article said that he met General Pancho Villa, one of the opponents of the Mexican usurper Huerta, and these are the two sides in the Mexican Civil War. And about a year later, there was another newspaper article that added, some time ago, he went out to Mexico and offered his services to Huerta, but Huerta did not want him. And so he went and fought with Villa on the opposite side. Um, and none of this was true. And it was just, messages getting mixed up. And, you can read the article, Debunking Freyberg's Myth, which is on the internet.
Well, let's link to it in the show notes.
But the best bit about it was was rather than denying it, Freiberg clearly realized that this was only only a great story, and there's nothing negative about publicity, and so encouraged the myth to grow. But,
Interesting.
incredible guy.
Yeah. Very colourful character. And I noticed that you shared a photo of him in the event on Facebook,
Yeah,
which was that at the saltwater baths?
that's at the Teatro Baths, that's right.
Yeah. So
So
he's, standing. I'll try and link to it in the show notes as well, but he's standing in one of those old-fashioned men's bathing costumes, and there's a huge crowd behind him. It's a great photo.
yeah, yeah. Zoom in on him.
Yeah.
Maybe
Uh,
that should be the theme for another year. We could get everyone to turn up in their early 20th century swimming
and their
costumes.
woolen woolen knitwear for swimming. Yeah. I was Googling this morning to see if there were any other heroic swims in history, and, one came up from John F. Kennedy. I don't know if you're familiar with his story. Yeah, apparently in World War II, he was in a boat in the Pacific that was, torpedoed by Japanese, um, you know, planes, and he ended up swimming quite a long distance to the nearest Pacific island, saving the lives of some of his crew. And then when they discovered that island had no water, he swam to another Pacific island nearby to collect some water and, well, not water, but food sources, and brought it back and was credited with saving 10 lives and
And
given.
is this true, Shona, or is this as true as Sir Bernard Freyberg's involvement?
Oh, good question. Well, I should reveal my sources, shouldn't I? Yeah. Well, I did check multiple sources. I hope it's correct. And the other story I found was there was a Maori woman in 1824 named Kahe Te-Rau-o-te-Rangi who swam. from Kapiti Island to the mainland. You're familiar with that one? With her baby daughter strapped to her
Yeah,
back.
yeah.
And so that's a distance of 11 kilometres, which and I've heard that's a challenging swim. I know some people who've done it recreationally, let alone, with a small child on their back.
It's very misleading. It has very, very strong currents.
Yeah.
Um, well, you probably know Vicky did it, the year before me, and she said, "Oh, you'll be fine. It's not very far." And, so I don't know, I had a gel or something like that on the boat, and, we got to about 300 meters from the shore, and my supporter said, "Would you want some nutrition?" And I said, "Oh, no, it's only 300 meters, we'll be finished quite soon." And I think 40 minutes later, I had literally made no progress because I was swimming into this current, and
Oh, no.
I could see the finish banner, and I was just swimming as hard as I could, going absolutely nowhere. Um, and if you stopped swimming, you just got swept right the way down the beach. So it took a lot longer than we were expecting.
Yes, I suppose that can be the case. There's the distance as the crow flies, and then there's the real distance that people swim on the day, right?
Absolutely.
I when I was reading about Bernard Freyberg, I saw that there was a newspaper article about him attempting an English Channel crossing as well. I don't know if you're aware of that. In
I heard about that. That's
1925, he almost made it, and then I think the tides shifted,
Mhm.
as happens with, yeah, I'll link to that article as well. It looked legitimate, and it said that he didn't quite make it across, which so it's probably a true story. But yeah.
It's surprised it didn't get amped up. It's funny actually because we have the Anzac Day swim has been so successful. We've now franchised it out to other New Zealand public holidays. So the Anzac Day swim is the sort of symbolic end of the open water swimming season for sensible people as we go from summer into winter, even though half the community seem to swim all the way through the year without a wetsuit. But the official beginning of the summer open water swimming season is Labour Weekend, which is in October, and that's sort of when things are starting to warm up. So we also have a Labour Weekend commemorative swim, and I decided that this year we were going to have some stories. So I decided to look at how the international labour movement and the Communist Party had been involved in swimming. And I found loads of stories about Chairman Mao, who apparently was it's like your Kennedy story, really. Apparently, he was a very keen swimmer. And there were all these propaganda stories about the great Chairman Mao's swimming prowess. And there were some stats, and these stats were that he'd swum 5K at an average of, 1 minute, 100-meter pace, which didn't really make it clear this was in some massive river like the Yangtze, which has a very high flow rate. And I think an empty bag of chippies would have been able to swim at about the same
Yeah,
speed.
that would definitely help with speed. How do you find, the task of organising a public swim event? Like, what are
That's
the
pretty straightforward these days. Well, I've got great hopes. I acknowledged Albie guiding mind and mentor. So Albie's still a serving soldier, and he and Claire were posted to Fiji 4 or 5 years ago, which is why I wound up picking up the responsibility of trying to run this thing. Um, uh, but I'm sure his tour of duty is due to finish soon, so I'm expecting him to come back at some point, and then he can take over with all his charisma and flair, and we'll probably have a much better organized event. No, we're pretty slick now. I think we have a
You're doing a great job.
system.
So speaking of heroic swims, I know that you've accomplished a few marathon swims yourself. You swam across Lake Taupō, is that right? And it's about 40 kilometres,
Yep,
depending on currents and wind, I assume,
straight you go.
and also the Cook Strait a couple of years ago. And I've heard your episodes from the Effortless Swimming podcast, which I can also link to.
Oh, wow, God.
Which is great. Yeah. Um, but I was curious to know when you started swimming in the ocean. Like, when did you join the Wellington swim community?
That's a good question. I've lived in New Zealand for 27 years now, I think. Um, and I had meant to get involved in triathlon when I moved here, and it took me about 10 years to do that. And part of triathlon in Wellington certainly is open water swimming. So I suppose that's when I began swimming comfortably in the sea um, and lakes. Um, And then I got mildly obsessive about Ironman, which is a bit of it's about the closest thing to being a member of a cult I think I've ever signed up for. Um, and when I sort of got a bit burnt out with all of that, I worked out that I was a much better swimmer than I was a cyclist or a runner, um, and quite enjoyed the culture. I found the open water swimming scene, not just in New Zealand, I think it's true everywhere actually, is it's a bit more relaxed than the triathlon scene. Triathletes are quite interested in numbers and discipline and stuff like that. Open water swimmers a bit more chill about these things. Uh, and I suppose you're very influenced by your company. So we have a rather wonderful squad who in the pool, in the Freyberg pool we were talking about, that's coached by um, a legend of not just New Zealand but world marathon swimming, Phil Rush. So Phil is quite famous. I talk about him in the podcast that you were talking about quite a bit. But Phil's a bit older than me now. And 35 years ago, Phil rather famously broke the speed record for swimming the English Channel, turned round, swam back, broke the two-way record for swimming the English Channel twice, turned round, swam back again, and broke the three-way record for swimming the English Channel. And his eternal regret is that he didn't get in and swim back for a fourth way, because he probably would have had the weather to pull it off.
Amazing. How I'm putting you on the spot here, but how long did it take him to swim the triple crossing?
It's embarrassing. It's really quick. It's about 30 hours, I think. And the trouble about doing it for that long is you have to go through turns of the tide, and when the tide turns, you don't go anywhere. You just have to keep swimming, going nowhere. Um, I mean, the most amazing thing about these records, so these are 35 years old, these records. Somebody's broken his one-way record, but his two and three-way records still stand. And some really great swimmers. This is the English Channel, right? This is the absolute acme of world marathon swimming, and no one's even got close to breaking them. The most extraordinary fact: we had a moment in marathon swimming, would have been 6 or 7 years ago, when the American swimmer Sarah Thomas did what Phil never managed to do and swam the English Channel 4 ways, and that's a record that may never be broken. You need such a long period of good weather, as well as the right person and the right support team. And the statistic is that when she finished her second crossing of the English Channel, Phil had already finished his third crossing. That's how fast he was swimming. Unbelievable. And yeah, so he has this swim squad, all my friends. And I think when I started getting interested in it, there was about 130 people in history had swum the Cook Strait, and we had 15 people in the swim squad who had swum the Cook Strait. So I don't know,
That's a pretty high success rate.
you think these things are normal.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's partly because it's Wellington, right? So it's local from where we are. And then the story is that Phil spends his summers supporting international swimmers crossing the Cook Strait. And when in 2020 New Zealand closed their borders because of COVID, he marched into squad and he said, "Well, that's great. I've got a completely full order book for next year and no one can get in. So if any of you guys want to do anything, this is probably the year." And his system is that if you've never done anything like that, he gets you to swim the long axis of Lake Taupō, which you mentioned. So for our non-local listeners, Lake Taupō is the hole in the donut that is the North Island of New Zealand. So it's the cold era of a truly enormous extinct volcano. Well, we hope it's extinct. So the long axis is just over 40 kilometers, and you swim diagonally across the lake in its furthest points. And it's quite a good test because as a lake, it doesn't really have any currents. There's a couple of streams that flow into it, but it's not like it's tidal or anything. You only do it when the weather's all right, so you don't really have to deal with terribly difficult conditions unless you're unlucky. And it's a really long way, so it's a very good test of whether you have the mental strength or stubbornness or whatever to train for something like that, and whether you have the mental strength and stubbornness to be in your own head for what in my case was just over 14 hours. Um, and I think Phil's view is that if you spend a season doing that and you're successful, then you'll probably be in a position to have a crack at Cook Strait. The difference with the big ocean swims is, of course, dealing with the tides. And the Cook Strait has a very large tidal range because it's a narrow gap between two enormous bodies of water. So when the tide turns, um, even as close as possible to low tide, there's a sort of 2 to 3 meter tidal difference. So that's what you're swimming against when the tide turns on you. So you actually need to be able to swim at about 3 kilometers an hour in the open water without a wetsuit in order to be able to make progress and get through. Um, yeah, so I'd just assumed that would be beyond me, but I got a lot faster through the Lake Taupō experience, and we were still locked down in the following year in 2022, as it was. So I thought, well, might as well give it a crack, and did that. And then I never got to swim because the weather, the way these big ocean swims go, is that you can only really attempt them within 2 or 3 days of low tide. So you have these little what they call tide windows, but then it's just a question of whether the weather behaves itself. So if it's incredibly windy, it's not even worth trying. And we'd had this gorgeous summer, and then as soon as we got into my tide window, the weather went absolutely bananas, and so we didn't get to try it. You wait 2 weeks for the next tide window, same thing happened again. And after
And
three,
that must be quite challenging, so mentally as well. You've psyched yourself up for this big swim and you have to.
yeah, somebody said it's a little bit like sort of extreme mountaineering, where the climbers they trek their way into the bottom of K2 or whatever, and then they just have to wait for the weather to come right, but they've got to keep themselves fit and active. So it's quite different from like if you're running a marathon or doing an Ironman or something, you sort of know when you're meant to be doing it, and you do all your training, and then you taper, and then the day arrives and you do your thing, and then we're fine. Whereas with these swims, you do all your training and you taper into your window, and then you sort of wait, and then you suddenly get told it's not happening. They have to start training again, and then you have a week of that, and then you taper back into the next window. So it's like a sort of sawtooth that you're working your way through. But by the time we'd been through 4 tide windows, it was really late in the season. So it was May, and it was starting to get really cold. And I remember I had this phone call with Phil, and he goes, "Right, mate, I'm not saying it's not going to happen." And I thought, "Okay, here we go." And he goes, "We just need to think about risk." And I'm not convinced you've spent enough time getting cold. And I was like, "Okay." And he was just trying to get me to tell him that I didn't think I was ready to do it that late in the season.
Right.
So I had this lovely summer doing all these fun things and training with all my friends and having a nice time, and I didn't even do the swim. And then the following year, we started seeing the COVID restrictions being lifted. And I thought, "Oh, well, might as well give it another crack." Um, so, um, yeah, so we picked a much earlier tide window this time. I said, "Right, which is the warmest weekend of the year? Let's go for that one." And that was the end of January, and 2 years ago. And yeah, and it just went like clockwork, really. Sort of turned up, hopped in, did my swim,
You make it sound so easy. Hopped and did my swim. Sounds like you're just sort of pootling around the fountain in Oriental Bay. Oh, congratulations. It's phenomenal. And I love the way you described the Lake Taupō swim as well as almost like a test or a warm up for the Cook Strait because the Lake Taupō swim in itself is a phenomenal marathon swim.
Long way. You should. There's some lovely interviews with Phil floating around on the internet where he talks about his three-way English Channel crossing, and he talks about laps. He says, "Well, it was just after the first lap when I'd had something to eat, so I was getting ready to get stuck into the second lap," and that really does sound like he's swimming around the fountain. This is like 7 or 8 hours of swimming, and he just ticks them off one after another. In
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe that's the way to approach it, right? It's just a mindset. It's just a little swim. Yeah. Did you feel, you've probably been asked this before, but did you feel different after completing these large swims? Like, did you feel like your relationship with the water had changed? Was it hard to go back to just being a regular sort of weekend swimmer again after you'd done these marathons?
Not really. I find it's very tasky. There's so much to do, and when you're doing it, a lot of the elite triathlon coaches talk about process focus. You're not really focused on the outcome. You're just focused on what you're doing and the execution. So that's what you're absorbed in when you're doing it. So I didn't have some great spiritual epiphany when I sort of finished or anything. In fact, when I finished the Cook Strait, it got very swelly as I came in to the South Island because you never really know where you're going to wind up. I mean, it's a question of how fast you swim and what the currents and tides are doing. So I was just next to some random rocks with a gannet sitting on top of them. But the sea was moving a lot. There was a lot of kelp, giant seaweed. Um, and it was getting quite rough, and so I had no time to touch the rock and think enlightened things about my changing relationship with the sea, as Phil was barking at me, telling me to get out of there before I got smashed to pieces by some unexpected wave. Um,
Enough.
uh, and then, of course, you swim up to the inflatable boat that he's sitting in. You get hauled in rather undignifiedly, covered in grease, and then you get thrown onto the launch, wrapped up in blankets to stay warm, and then you go into some sort of mild hypothermic shock. So it's not very glamorous, really. I'm sure you sort of watch movies about adventures like this, and it looks like everyone's a complete hero. But
There was no sort of swelling orchestral music playing as you finished your swim?
um, yeah, but I mean, it was a wonderful journey, and in many ways, I mean, I think it's the journey was as important as the day itself. I mean, the fun we had getting ready, the support I had from my friends, all these wonderful, and had lots of trips to try and make it interesting. Sort of go traveling all over the country, in fact, all over the world, doing interesting swims just to try and mix it up. But the day itself was pretty special. Yeah, I think I said in one of the interviews, I got a text message from another famous Wellington marathon swimmer, Casey Glover. So Casey held the speed record for swimming Cook Strait for nearly 20 years. It was broken last year, and it's ridiculous. It was like something 4 hours and 45 minutes or something totally insane. And he sent me this text, and it said. Um, if the wind's on your side, then surf across. And it was like a sort of Harry Potter Horcrux puzzle. And I was thinking, what on earth is he talking about? But one of my friends explained what he was talking about. And that was exactly what was going on. We had the wind behind us. So I was meant to you're meant to get up out of the water so the wind is at your back and you're swimming over the top of the waves.
Right.
Um, yeah, so even as a swim, it couldn't have been more different from the Taupō swim because it was so varied. So we had 2 hours of that, then you go into slack water, that's different again. Then you have a steady period, and then we have these upwellings where the water temperature drops very dramatically. And yeah, exciting all the way.
You mentioned the giant kelp at the end. Did you see any other marine life in your swim?
I
Things
had
that
a
are accompanied by dolphins and
I had a little dolphin came over to say hi. Apparently, the rest of his family were talking to the main launch, so I didn't see them. But he came over and started talking to me. Little
Oh,
squeaks under the water. It's pretty special.
that's cool. So do you feel the need to plan another marathon swim now, or do you feel you've done enough?
No, I'm sort of happy. I think. I mean, there's this thing called the New Zealand Triple Crown. So that's swimming across Lake Taupō, Cook Strait, and then Fovo Strait, which is between Stewart Island, which is the third island of New Zealand at the very southern tip of the South Island and the mainland. And that is very, very cold and full of sharks. And it doesn't really appeal, if I'm absolutely honest.
Fair
But
enough.
maybe one day I will wake up and suddenly have a drive to do something else. We've had a few of the locals have been pioneering really long swims in some of the southern lakes in central Otago over the last few years, um, which is quite appealing. It's a lovely part of the country that's pretty special. I mean, the Cook Strait project was pretty special because it's Wellington and it's very much a part of my life. But similarly, Lake Wanaka, Lake Wakatipu, these are places you spend a lot of time, but they're very cold, except in unusually warm summers. And they're a really long ways. I think I'd need you've got to want to do stuff like this. It's not just a whimsical thing that you do, just on the off chance. The
Yeah, there's a lot of preparation and training involved.
preparation and
Yeah.
training.
You mentioned you're in Phil Rush's squad. So what's a typical week of swimming for you now? Like, what's your swim routine?
Well, I usually swim with squads 3 or 4 times a week. So twice with Phil, twice with another squad, um, and do a bit of swimming in the harbour in the summer with people if it's a nice day. When we swim at Freyberg, we always go and jump in the harbour afterwards, and probably get as far as the pontoon. That's about the size of it. But it's all pretty recreational at the moment.
Yeah, fair enough. And are you one of these people who enjoys swimming at night in the full moon? I know there are a few full moon groups in Wellington.
Yeah, yeah. Apparently, there's one on Sunday, isn't there? No, no. Marina was giving me a hard time about it yesterday. She was saying, "How come you never join the lunatics?" So, no particular reason. It's just I never remember, and whenever I do, I'm doing something else. So I'm sure I'll get there one day.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks very much for coming on, John, and giving us a slice of swim history in Wellington. Is there anything else you want to talk about that we haven't already covered?
No, it's been fun. Look forward to hearing your emerging series on swim history with a New Zealand twist.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Swim Chats. Please remember to follow or subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. And if you enjoyed it, you can leave a 5-star rating and review, which helps other people find it too. Enjoy the water, and we'll see you next time.